The studio lights burned hot, casting a harsh glow on the sleek set of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The audience buzzed with anticipation, their murmurs a low hum beneath the pulsing theme music. Jimmy Kimmel, all smirks and sharp eyes, leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the desk. Across from him sat Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood legend, his weathered face carved from stone, eyes narrowed like a gunslinger sizing up a foe. The air crackled with tension, not the playful banter of a late-night talk show, but something raw, something dangerous. The crowd sensed it, their chatter fading as Jimmy's grin widened, predatory and deliberate. "Clint, it's an honor," Jimmy began, his voice syrupy with mock sincerity. "You've been in this game forever, haven't you? I mean, you're practically a fossil." The audience laughed, but it was uneasy. The kind of laughter that follows a jab you know will draw blood. Clint's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair. He didn't come here for this. He'd agreed to the interview to promote his latest film, a gritty war drama, not to be dissected like some relic on display. "Get to the point, Kimmel," Clint growled, his voice low, gravelly, cutting through the studio's artificial warmth. The audience shifted, sensing the shift in tone. Jimmy's eyes gleamed, like a shark catching the scent of blood in the water. He leaned forward, his smile never faltering, but there was venom in it now, a calculated cruelty. "Oh, I will, Clint, I will," Jimmy said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But let's talk about you. The man, the myth, the mystery. You've got this tough guy image, right? The squinting cowboy, the dirty cop. But there's more to you, isn't there? Stuff you don't talk about. Stuff you've buried." The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath. Clint's face darkened, his eyes boring into Jimmy with an intensity that could have stopped a heart. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls were closing in. "What the hell are you playing at?" Clint snapped, his voice a whip crack. He leaned forward, his frame coiled like a spring, ready to unleash. Jimmy didn't flinch. If anything, his grin grew sharper, his eyes alight with the thrill of provocation. "I'm just asking what everyone wants to know," Jimmy shot back, his tone mocking. "You've got skeletons, Clint. We all do. But yours? They're loud. They rattle, like that incident back in '68. You remember '68, don't you?" The audience was silent now, hanging on every word, their eyes darting between the two men. Clint's hands clenched into fists, the veins in his forearms bulging. The mention of '68 wasn't random. Jimmy had done his homework digging into whispers from Clint's past, a murky incident involving a bar fight, a broken bottle. "You don't know what you're talking about," Clint cut in, his voice a low snarl. "You think you can sit there, with your cheap suit and your cheaper jokes, and drag me through the mud? You're nothing but a vulture, Kimmel, picking at scraps." The crowd gasped again, some clapping, others frozen, unsure whether to cheer or brace for impact. Jimmy's smile faltered for a split second, but he recovered, leaning back with a theatrical sigh. "Touchy, touchy," Jimmy said, wagging a finger. "But I'm not the one with blood on my hands, am I? Tell us, Clint, what happened that night? Who got hurt? Who didn't walk away?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Clint's eyes blazed, his chest heaving. He hadn't spoken about '68 in decades, hadn't let it surface in his mind. It was a wound he'd cauterized long ago, or so he thought. Now here was this smarmy talk show host, ripping it open for the world to see. "You want a story?" Clint said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Keep pushing, and you'll get one you won't like." The threat was unmistakable, and for the first time Jimmy's confidence wavered, his eyes flicking to the producers off stage. The audience was on edge, the tension so thick it was suffocating. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a showdown, and neither man was backing down. The studio was a pressure cooker, the silence between Clint Eastwood and Jimmy Kimmel a living thing, pulsing with menace. Clint's threat hung in the air, his words sharp as a blade, and the audience held its breath, waiting for the next move. Jimmy, for all his bravado, looked rattled, his fingers twitching on the desk, but he wasn't about to let Clint have the last word. He straightened, his smirk returning, though it was strained, like a mask slipping over fear. "Big words, Clint," Jimmy said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "But you're not scaring anyone. This isn't one of your movies. You can't just squint and make me disappear." The audience tittered nervously, but it was clear Jimmy was forcing the confidence, his eyes darting to the crowd for validation. Clint didn't blink, his stare unrelenting, the kind that could peel paint off a wall. He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble, each word deliberate, cutting. "You think this is a game, Kimmel? You think you can drag up my past, twist it, for your little ratings boost, and I'll just sit here and take it? You're out of your depth, boy." The word boy landed like a slap, and Jimmy's face flushed, his jaw tightening. The audience murmured, some gasping, others whispering, the tension ratcheting up to unbearable levels. Jimmy's eyes narrowed, his composure cracking as he shot back, his voice rising, sharp and venomous. "Don't patronize me, old man," Jimmy spat, slamming his hand on the desk. "You're not untouchable. You're not some god. You're just a guy who's been dodging the truth for 50 years. That night in '68, Clint, it wasn't just a bar fight, was it? There was a girl, wasn't there? And she didn't just walk away with a bruise." The accusation was a grenade, lobbed with precision, and the audience erupted in shocked gasps, their whispers turning to a low roar. Clint's face went white, then red, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. "You lying bastard," Clint snarled, his voice shaking with fury. "You don't know a damn thing about her, about what happened. You're making it up, spinning, garbage for these idiots to clap at." He gestured at the audience, who bristled, some booing, others shouting in his defense. The set was chaos now, the producers hovering off stage, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the carnage play out. Jimmy seized the moment, leaning forward, his voice dripping with malice. "Am I lying, Clint? Or are you just scared to face it? You've built this whole myth, this tough guy act, but it's crumbling. Tell us about her. Tell us why she never spoke about it. Tell us why you left town the next day." Each word was a jab, and Clint's eyes burned, his chest heaving as he fought to keep control. The mention of the girl, a name he hadn't spoken in decades, hit like a sledgehammer. She was a ghost he'd buried, a memory tied to a night of regret. And now Jimmy was dragging her into the spotlight. "Shut your mouth," Clint said, his voice low, deadly, each syllable a warning. "You're digging a hole you can't climb out of." But Jimmy was too far gone, fueled by the crowd's reaction, by the thrill of cornering a legend. He stood up, something talk show hosts rarely did, and pointed at Clint, his voice booming. "Then prove me wrong," Jimmy shouted. "Tell the truth. Stop hiding behind your squint and your Oscars. What happened to her, Clint? What did you do?" The audience was on its feet now, some yelling, others frozen, the studio a powder keg ready to explode. Clint rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his presence towering despite his age. He stepped toward Jimmy, who flinched but held his ground, their faces inches apart. "You want the truth?" Clint whispered, his voice so quiet it was almost drowned by the crowd, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "You couldn't handle it, and you sure as hell don't deserve it." For a moment it seemed like he might swing, his fist clenched, his body taut. Jimmy's eyes widened, a flicker of fear breaking through his bravado. The producers signaled, frantically the stage manager stepping forward, but Clint turned, his gaze sweeping the audience, his disgust palpable, before he took a step toward the exit. Clint Eastwood's boots echoed on the polished stage floor, each step a deliberate act of defiance as he moved toward the exit. The audience was a sea of stunned faces, their shouts and murmurs blending into a chaotic hum. Jimmy Kimmel stood, frozen, his bravado shattered by the raw fury in Clint's parting words. The studio felt like it was teetering on the edge of a riot, the air electric with the aftermath of their confrontation. But Jimmy wasn't done. His pride stung, his ego bruised. He lunged forward, grabbing the microphone from his desk, his voice booming through the speakers, sharp and desperate. "You can't just walk away, Clint," Jimmy yelled, his face red, veins bulging in his neck. "You don't get to dodge this. You owe them the truth." He pointed at the audience, who erupted in a mix of cheers and boos, some egging him on, others loyal to the legend now striding toward the shadows. Clint stopped, his back to Jimmy, his shoulders tense, the weight of decades bearing down on him. The mention of the girl, the night in '68, had torn open a scar he'd spent a lifetime ignoring, and now this loudmouth was demanding he bleed. For the cameras. Slowly, Clint turned, his eyes locking onto Jimmy's with a ferocity that made the host take a step back. "Owe them?" Clint said, his voice a low growl carrying across the silent studio. "I don't owe you or them a damn thing. You think you can judge me? You, with your fake tears and your scripted apologies? You're a parasite, Kimmel, feeding off other people's pain." The audience gasped, some clapping, others shouting, the divide between them growing. Jimmy's face twisted, his anger flaring anew at the insult. "Parasite?" Jimmy shot back, storming toward Clint, the microphone clutched like a weapon. "You're the one who's been hiding, Clint. You're the one who let that girl suffer, who let her name get buried while you built your empire. You're no hero, you're a coward." The word coward hit like a gunshot, and Clint's eyes blazed, his body coiling as if ready to strike. The stage manager rushed forward, arms outstretched, pleading for calm, but neither man noticed. The audience was screaming now, some chanting Clint's name, others hurling insults at Jimmy. "You don't know her name," Clint said, his voice shaking with rage, each word a blade. "You don't know what she went through, what I went through. You're throwing darts in the dark, hoping something sticks. But you're done, Kimmel. You crossed a line you can't uncross." He took a step toward Jimmy, who flinched, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Clint's presence. The producers were in a panic, signaling for a commercial break, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the chaos. Jimmy, cornered, doubled down, his voice shrill. "Then say her name, Clint. Say it. Prove I'm wrong. You can't, can you? Because you're guilty." The accusation was a desperate gambit, and it backfired. Clint's face softened for a fleeting moment, not with weakness, but with a pain so raw it silenced the room. The audience felt it, their shouts dying down, their eyes fixed on the man who'd been their icon for generations. He looked at Jimmy, not with anger now, but with something worse. Pity. "Her name was Anna," Clint said, his voice barely above. A whisper, yet it carried a weight that crushed the studio's frenzy. "And you don't get to use her for your circus." The revelation was a bombshell, not because it confirmed Jimmy's accusations, but because it humanized Clint in a way no one expected. The audience was riveted, some wiping tears, others leaning forward, desperate to understand. Jimmy, sensing he'd lost control, scrambled to regain it, his voice cracking as he pointed at Clint. "Anna, huh? So you admit it. You admit something happened." Jimmy's words were frantic, grasping, but they fell flat. The audience wasn't with him anymore. They were with Clint, drawn to the vulnerability in his voice, the unspoken story behind his pain. Clint shook his head, his disgust palpable, and turned again toward the exit, his steps slower now, as if carrying a burden he'd long tried to outrun. Jimmy, humiliated, shouted after him, his voice echoing in the vast studio, but Clint didn't look back. Clint Eastwood's silhouette loomed in the dim light of the stage's edge, his slow, deliberate steps carrying him toward the exit, each one a rejection of the chaos behind him. The name Anna still hung in the air, a raw wound exposed, and the audience was spellbound, their earlier frenzy replaced by a heavy, reverent silence. Jimmy Kimmel, his face a mask of desperation, stood center stage, the microphone trembling in his hand. His gamble had collapsed, his attempt to unravel a legend backfiring spectacularly. The crowd's eyes were on Clint, their loyalty shifting, and Jimmy's voice cracked with panic as he tried to claw back control. "You don't get to play the victim, Clint," Jimmy shouted, his words shrill, echoing off the studio walls. "You say her name like it means something, but you're still dodging. What happened to Anna? Why won't you tell us? You're running, just like you did back then." The accusation was a wild swing, and the audience bristled, some booing, others shouting for Jimmy to stop. Clint paused, his hand on the curtain, leading off stage, his back still to the host. The tension was unbearable, the studio a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Then Clint turned, his face etched with a mix of exhaustion and resolve, his eyes locking onto Jimmy's with a force that made the host shrink. "Running?" Clint said, his voice low, steady, cutting through the noise like a knife. "I've carried that night every damn day of my life. You're just chasing clicks, stirring up pain you can't even fathom. You're not a man, Kimmel. You're a child with a microphone." The audience erupted, some cheering, others gasping, the weight of Clint's words landing like a verdict. Jimmy's face twisted, his pride shredded, and he stormed forward, his voice rising to a near scream. "Don't lecture me about being a man," Jimmy spat, his finger jabbing toward Clint. "You're the one who left Anna in the dust, who built a career while she was forgotten. You think saying her name makes you noble? It makes you pathetic." The insult was a mistake, and Jimmy knew it the moment it left his lips. The audience turned on him, their boos deafening, a wave of anger crashing over the set. Clint's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch, his presence towering, unyielding. "Pathetic?" Clint said, stepping back toward the stage, his voice calm but laced with steel. "You want to talk about pathetic? Look at you, Kimmel, digging up a dead girl's name for your little show, thinking it'll make you relevant. You're not exposing me. You're exposing yourself." The crowd roared, their cheers shaking the studio, and Jimmy's face went pale, his hands shaking as he realized he'd lost them completely. The producers were frantic, waving for a cut, but the cameras stayed on, capturing the unraveling of a host who'd pushed too far. Clint moved closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but it carried a chilling intensity. "Anna was my friend. She was caught in a mess I couldn't stop, and I've paid for it every day since. You don't get to weaponize her. You don't get to cheapen her life for your ego." The revelation hit the audience like a tidal wave, their gasps audible, some crying openly, others nodding in solidarity. Jimmy, cornered, tried to interrupt, his voice weak, desperate. "You're lying," Jimmy stammered, but it was hollow, a last-ditch effort to salvage his dignity. "You're spinning this to save face." Clint shook his head, his disgust and palpable, and turned away again, this time with a finality that silenced even Jimmy's protests. The audience was on its feet, their applause building, not just for Clint, but for the truth he'd laid bare, the pain he'd owned in a way Jimmy never could. As Clint reached the curtain, he paused, looking out at the crowd, his eyes softening. For the first time. "You want to know who I am?" he said, his voice steady, resonant. "I'm the guy who keeps going no matter what, and I don't need your pity, or his." He pointed at Jimmy without looking, the gesture dismissing the host entirely. The audience cheered louder, their respect for Clint cemented, while Jimmy stood alone, the microphone limp in his hand, his career teetering on the edge of ruin. The roar of the audience filled the studio, a tidal wave of applause crashing over the set as Clint Eastwood stood at the curtain's edge, his final words echoing like a gavel strike. Jimmy Kimmel, alone in the spotlight, looked small, his shoulders slumped, the microphone dangling uselessly in his hand. The crowd's cheers were for Clint, for the raw honesty he'd delivered, for the way he'd turned Jimmy's ambush into a moment of unyielding strength. The air was charged, not with the chaos of their earlier clash, but with a profound respect for a man who'd faced his past and walked away taller. Clint's eyes swept the audience one last time, a flicker of gratitude in his gaze, before he pushed through the curtain, his exit a statement louder than words. Jimmy scrambled to regain control, his voice cracking as he forced a laugh, trying to salvage the wreckage of his show. "Well, folks, that's Clint Eastwood for you, always. Dramatic," he said, but the joke landed like a stone, the audience's boos drowning him out. Their loyalty was with Clint, and Jimmy's attempt to play it off only deepened their scorn. He gestured weakly to the band, signaling for music, but the cameras lingered on the empty space where Clint had stood, the weight of his departure palpable. Offstage, the producers were in a frenzy, shouting into headsets, knowing the footage would dominate headlines by morning. Backstage, Clint moved through the dimly lit corridor, his boots heavy on the concrete floor, his face set in a mask of resolve. The pain of Anna's memory lingered, a dull ache he'd carried for decades, but speaking her name, reclaiming her from Jimmy's cheap exploitation, had freed something in him. He'd come to promote a film, but he'd left with something more, the chance to set a piece of his past right, not for the world, but for himself. A stagehand approached, offering water, but Clint waved him off, his mind already elsewhere, focused on the life he'd built beyond the scandals and the spotlight. On stage, Jimmy's show limped to a close, his usual charm replaced by a forced grin that fooled no one. The audience's energy had shifted, their whispers buzzing with awe for Clint's defiance, their disdain for Jimmy's cruelty. As the house lights dimmed, social media was already ablaze, clips of the confrontation, spreading like wildfire, hashtags trending, the world dissecting every word, every glance. Jimmy's team scrambled to spin the narrative, but the damage was done. He'd underestimated Clint, mistaking age for weakness, and now his reputation hung by a thread, his ambush exposed as petty and hollow. Clint, meanwhile, stepped into the cool night air outside the studio, the Los Angeles skyline glittering in the distance. A small crowd of fans waited by the exit, their phones raised, but they lowered them as he approached, sensing the moment's gravity. "Thank you, Clint," one called, her voice choked with emotion, and others nodded, their respect unspoken, but clear. He gave a slight nod, the closest he'd come to a smile all night, and climbed into a waiting car. As it pulled away, he leaned back, closing his eyes, the weight of the evening settling into something like peace. He'd faced the fire, owned his truth, and walked away on his terms, leaving Jimmy to choke on his own venom. The story didn't end with a brawl or a tearful confession, but with a quieter triumph, one that resonated deeper. Clint hadn't just won a shouting match. He'd reclaimed his narrative, turning a trap into a testament to his resilience. The world would talk, the headlines would scream, but none of it mattered. He'd spoken Anna's name, honored her memory, and silenced a bully, all without raising a fist. The audience, both in the studio and beyond, felt it, their hearts stirred by a man who'd faced his demons and emerged unbroken. Jimmy's show would go on, but its host would carry the scars of this night, a reminder never to cross a legend again. Clint, though, was already looking forward, his legacy not just intact, but burnished, a beacon of grit and grace in a world too quick to tear its heroes down.